Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast. And now, Dan Lane.
Charles, do you think it ever makes sense to sell a rental property?
Well, when I originally started, I was thinking, no, it didn't make sense to sell a rental property. However, over time, I had learned that certain assets performed better than others, in which case I started changing my mind a little bit. And I do think there are some scenarios which it makes sense to sell your rental properties.
Charles isn't talking about selling all of his rentals, but every once in a while, if you have a property that isn't performing as well as it should be, it might make sense to sell that property and buy something else that's going to give you a higher return. And that's what Charles has done. He had a couple of properties that weren't doing that great. He sold them. And we'll talk about why he decided to sell, what happened, and what he's doing with that money. Joining us on the show today from San Diego is Charles Goodwin. We'll take a quick break to thank our sponsors. We'll come right back and we'll talk to Charles. It's a lot of work to find a really good rental property. And when you actually find that property, you want to make sure you're working with a lender that can get that loan closed. The lender that I recommend is Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group. She's a nationwide lender and her specialty is helping investors finance rental properties. She has a ton of loan programs and she can find something customized to you for your situation. If you want to find out more or you're ready to get started today, just go to ridgelendinggroup.com. That's RIDGE lendinggroup.com. NMLS 42056.
Rental Income Podcast.
Charles, let's start off talking about your portfolio. What does your portfolio look like today?
So as of today, I own 10 single-family rentals. They're scattered throughout central Texas. So a few in the Waco, Killeen, Copperas Cove area, a couple in San Antonio, one just outside of Austin, and they're all single-family homes.
Now, you live in California. Why did you invest in Texas?
Yeah, it's a great question. Kind of by accident, but kind of on purpose as well. One of my partners lives in Austin, so these areas that the rental properties are owned in are all within about a 90-minute drive of Austin. But on top of that, I had been purchasing properties to flip in the Northern California region. But those properties from a cash flow perspective just didn't look, nearly as strong. When you look at the rents compared to the values, which will then correlate to your monthly mortgage, in California, it's much harder to find that cash flow. In some areas. So in Texas, it just made a lot more sense from how that equation looked.
So has the distance been an issue at all?
The distance, I would say, has not been an issue. The distance is just something that you need to create the proper processes so you can prevent some challenges that might arise from long distance investing from occurring.
Okay. And your partner is local. He lives near the rentals?
He is local. He's about 90 minutes away.
Okay.
So, in case of emergency, he can drive out there. Frankly, we do invest to try to be as passive as possible, though. So, we'd only have him go out there if absolutely needed.
When you're buying a property, do you fly in to look at it, or does he just go and take a look?
I personally don't. Out of all the investment properties, I've rarely stepped foot in any of the ones that I've purchased. My partner would go to some of the properties prior to purchase. I have purchased a couple sight unseen that I don't do that anymore. But then I also have done, true third-party inspections when the contract or the situation allowed for such.
So how's it been working out so far with the partnership? Different people some people love partners, some people don't like it. How has it been working out for you?
Yeah, I get a great feeling out of my partnership that I have. I've used a couple different partners or worked with a couple different partners. The main thing that I feel the partnership benefits from, at least as of today, is an additional decision maker. What I have found is, sometimes, you can get emotional when you're trying to buy a property, or maybe it's been, longer than you would have liked since you purchased that last property, might cause you to take an unnecessary risk. So, at this point, I think a partner serves as a very healthy, additional decision maker as a part of the process.
Did you guys have like a written agreement before you went into the partnership, or is it just something that you guys work out as you go?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we did create a formal operating agreement as a part of the LLC. That operating agreement probably wasn't as detailed, as it should have been. The operating agreement more or less stated that, we're equal partners with equal capital contributions that equally share in profits. The aspects of the role that we played within the business, acquisitions versus management versus financing versus whatever, those were not as clearly laid out on paper. However, those were kind of mutually agreed upon on just phone calls and meetings that we had. And those responsibilities have changed over time, and they have caused some minor disagreements here or there, but they have been things that we've been able to work through. So I do recommend being very explicit and on paper, with roles and responsibilities when entering into a partnership.
So everything's 50-50. If you're going to buy a property and you need $20,000 to close on the property, you would each kick in $10,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, we started with a flipping business, and we used that to generate some, additional capital that we could use to, slide over to the rental business. And what it turned out to was just, a bank account with a big chunk of capital between the two of us. And we started buying rental properties that were used for down payments, renovations, mortgage payments, etc.
That's interesting. Okay, so you guys were flipping houses first, and that generated a bunch of profit, and then you've used that profit to buy rentals.
Yeah, exactly. I went through kind of what I think is probably a common evolution for real estate investors. Was I was so attracted to flipping because of the kind of short-term, excess returns that it could provide. But then after a year or two, I started realizing that by flipping properties, you're just always going to be chasing the next deal.
Yep.
And not that that's a bad thing, but as I started to kind of drink the rental Kool-Aid a little bit, and as we got into the period where interest rates got real low, I really had this mental mindset shift of, hey, let's start buying properties that we can hold on to for long-term wealth and just have love what I've learned by doing so.
What a great way to come up with down payments. I think that's awesome. All right, so I want to talk about the properties you've sold, so that when you and your partner started buying properties, you wanted to buy these properties and hold on to them for forever or for a really long period of time. But along the way, you've sold off a couple of properties. What happened? Like, why did you decide to sell?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way I would describe it is, after owning these properties for, I started buying them in 2019, at least rentals. So, bought a handful most of them were purchased between 2019 and early 2022. And so I'd owned those properties for, call it, 3 to 4-ish years for now. And what I had learned is that not every property, even if it's in the same city, kind of appreciates or experiences the same level of rent growth as another property just in that same area. So over time, you might have a single family on one side of town that the rents have shown steady growth, and on the same town, but just on another side of it, a different property might not have experienced the same rent growth. And, really what makes the equation work over time is when your rents are growing and your values are growing, because, in residential real estate, you get the beauty of a fixed mortgage payment, which most of these are on fixed rate loans. So, when that rent goes up and your mortgage rate stays the same, or your mortgage payment stays the same, that's when that cash flow, really starts to improve. Mm-hmm. So when we had made decisions to sell off a couple of these properties, they were ones that just maybe weren't in as good of a neighborhood, that was not going up in terms of rent or appreciation as quickly. So what we had done is, I would call it a consolidation. It's selling off a couple of these that won't be as great of long-term assets based on appreciation and rent growth. And, the intention is to repurpose them for future purchases.
Now, is there any way or anything maybe that you missed when you were buying these properties, like to save yourself the hassle of having to buy it and then turn around and sell it? Like, do you think you could have, looking back on it, is there any signs that you could have picked up on that would have told you this maybe wasn't the best investment?
Yeah, absolutely. What I think is it's what you spoke to earlier around the concept of not being local. I think that's what immediately jumps out in my head as something that could have been done differently. When I had first started purchasing properties, I had not been doing as much diligence on the neighborhood as I really should have. So just even zooming around on Google Maps, or better yet, driving it with your own two eyes and seeing, how is pride of ownership in that neighborhood? Are folks taking care of their homes, and is there strong pride of ownership that would lead you to believe that's going to be a better neighborhood? Are you looking at things like the school districts? Are you looking at things like days on market for the resale market? And those are kind of cues that you can pick up on to see, is this neighborhood better than a different neighborhood within that same city? So looking back on it, that's one thing that I would have changed.
Yeah, I often think that the neighborhood is maybe more important than the property. Do you think I'm right on that?
I personally completely agree with you. I think there are things that you need to look out for with a property. You don't want to be the most expensive property on the block, or a funky looking property, but in general, the neighborhood is just so important. It's just so incredibly apparent where, these properties, a handful of them have really just, rents have continued to rise at very fast pace. Same with price appreciation, and others, in the same town, just maybe a couple miles away, just not so much.
So as far as them being rentals, like, did the properties maybe not rent as fast, or did they have more turnover, or did you just have more problems than you were having with compared to your other rentals?
Yeah, it's all of the above.
Okay.
Properties that are in neighborhoods that aren't as strong, they tend to take a little bit longer to rent. The rents will not go up as fast. You might get a lower quality tenant. So all those reasons are why neighborhood and rentals, it just matters so much based on what I've learned.
Yeah, I mean, I had a property like that I sold. But I kept thinking things are going to turn around. Like, I just need a better tenant. If I give it more time, it's going to turn around. Were you thinking the same thing, that, well, maybe if we just hold on to it a little bit longer, things will get better?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We probably experienced a similar occurrence where, I had thought that holding on to it, maybe you just get a better tenant, and maybe we got unlucky with this tenant. But, I think after we went through, 2 or 3 or even 4 cycles of, old tenant out, new tenant in, you have some, higher than expected turnover costs in terms of maintenance and all that type of thing. You just kind of learned, and who knows, maybe it wasn't a good decision. Maybe it was, but just always going to keep looking forward.
So then how did it work out when you sold? Like, were you able to make a profit on the properties?
Definitely at least a little bit of a profit.
Okay.
Thankfully these properties were mostly purchased, in the period of very robust price appreciation. So there was some equity that had built up, and plus we raised the values of these properties by doing renovations on them. Our strategy from the beginning was buy something that was in need of maintenance, some sort of distress situation, something like that, and create value by doing renovations on them. But then, instead of selling them like a flipper might, we refinance, that traditional BRRRR method, as some folks are familiar with. And the great thing about that, being able to build up the equity, was in terms of the excess equity that was left over upon sale, we used at least some of that to pay down loan balances of maybe some higher interest rate loans. And for example, one of them was with a community bank that let us reset the payment based on a lower loan amount. So that boosted the cash flow of the remaining portfolio.
Wow, that's pretty smart. Okay, so you had a blanket mortgage for a couple different properties? And
yep, that's exactly right.
Okay. And then, so when you sold the property, you took the profit, paid down that mortgage. So now you had a smaller mortgage payment.
Yeah. So, for example, we had one property or one mortgage that had four properties on it, just a blanket mortgage. And then we sold one of those properties. We used the reserves to pay off the original balance for that property, like relative to the full portfolio. However, we also had excess equity built up. So we took some of that equity and paid the remaining blanket mortgage down further. And it was a community bank, and the bank let us kind of lower the payment proportionally to the amount we paid it down. So not only did we just get the general mortgage balance down, we also helped the remaining cash flow of the three other properties still in that portfolio.
That's pretty awesome. What a great ending. I mean, to a property for two properties that weren't doing that great. You got out of there and you still made some money on it. I think the big lesson there is that buying the wrong property isn't necessarily a death sentence, that it can still end up being a good thing.
Oh, I completely agree with you. One of my, biggest pieces of advice for real estate investors, just even friends that I've talked to that want to get into it is, real estate is something where you fall forward. It's something that you make some mistakes, but as long as you're careful and don't make critical mistakes, there's so much that you can learn, and there's still ways to benefit, even from maybe just not buying the best asset. You just got to be careful with it.
Well, let's take a look at one of your deals. I always like to look at deals and see what people are buying. So the property we're going to be looking at, how did you find it?
This property, kind of got lucky with it. It was from a wholesaler. I have bought properties from wholesalers, and this wholesaler specifically was not local to this area. They ran a wholesaling business actually in a different state, and got an out-of-state lead that ended up working. And just through a mutual connection, who knew that I was purchasing properties in this area, gave me access to take a look at this property, and we ended up buying it.
Awesome. And this is a single family house?
Yep, this is a single family house. It's just outside of Austin, Texas, in a town called Pflugerville.
How many beds and baths?
It is a standard 3-bed, 2-bath, single family home, about 1,500 square feet.
Okay. And how much did you pay for it?
We purchased the property for $163,000.
Okay. And then did it need any rehab?
It did need rehab. We spent about $45,000 on it, just did a typical paint, bathrooms, bedroom, kitchen, flooring, all that type of stuff. We spent about $45,000 on it.
So you're all in at $208,000. And how much is your mortgage payment?
The mortgage payment on that was just under $1,700 a month.
Okay. And what's it rented for?
It's rented for $2,250 at the moment.
Okay. All right. So you've got $550 in extra cash. And now as far as your other expenses, how do you budget for vacancy or repairs or just things that might come up on the property?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was always taught kind of two rules of thumb when it comes to vacancy and maintenance. I budgeted for 10% of the monthly rent amount going to maintenance. So for example, if it was rented for $2,000 a month, I would prepare for $200 a month worth of maintenance costs. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of vacancies, I had always projected for 1 month out of the year to be vacant, right? So call it 1 of 12 worth of the rent to be a vacancy kind of allowance.
And now, how is that actually played out in real life? Like across your whole portfolio, do you see about a month vacancy for each property?
Yeah, it's a good question. I am right about a month, but as we go back to the earlier part of the conversation, it entirely depends on the neighborhood, right? Yeah. It depends on the property itself. I have a couple that are in great neighborhoods, and they rarely spend more than a few days or a week being listed for rent, and they get snapped up pretty quickly. And then others just not so much. It tends to be, about there, but can definitely fluctuate around the property.
Yeah. All right. So you're making a few $100 cash flow on this. Now, I know the area that you're investing in has seen a lot of appreciation. How are you doing on appreciation for this property?
Yeah, it's one of the great things about real estate. You know, when I was first purchasing these properties, I was so hyper focused on monthly cash flow that I wasn't thinking about appreciation as much. But this one has just benefited tremendously, you know, from appreciation over time. So, you know, like you had mentioned, we're all in on this one between purchase and repairs for around 208,000. But as of today, it's probably worth close to 350,000. So there's been quite a bit of equity
That's
built up over
awesome.
the course of just, you know, three years or so.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's really easy to miss that. I mean, I think, you know, myself included, I'm always looking at the cash flow. That's always the number one thing I'm looking at, but really in the background, your properties are going to appreciate as long as they're in a good area, a good growing area. So I
Yep.
think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, with that much equity there, do you ever consider tapping into that to continue to buy more properties?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's definitely possible as time goes on and depending where rates go. You know, if we get into a time where we're say, hey, we want to go and buy another 10 or 12 properties, we likely will tap into the equity for the purposes of scaling. You know, for now, as I was talking about earlier, where the portfolio is doing better overall in cash flow, you know, I don't mind sitting on the equity and just having that cash
Yeah.
flow come in. But then, you know, we certainly will gear up to kind of do another round of purchases, I think, fairly soon here. And it may be a good time to tap into that equity, just depending on the situation.
That's really kind of the magic of rental properties is as you build equity in properties, you can then tap into that equity, take the cash out, and then that's your down payments to keep building. And I just think you're in a really good spot. Congratulations. Well, if anybody wants to reach out to Charles, I've got his contact information on the website. You can find it at rentalincomepodcast.com/episode 475. I'd like to thank Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group for sponsoring today's episode. If you're looking to buy a rental property, whether you're just getting started or you want to add to your portfolio, reach out to Chaley. She's a nationwide lender. She has a ton of different loan programs, and she can find something that'll work for you in your situation. If you want to find out more or you want to set up a time to talk to Chaley personally, you can track her down at ridgelendinggroup.com, NMLS 42056. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast today. Make sure you hit the follow button on whatever podcast app you're listening to the show on, and you will get notified every single Tuesday when I put out a new episode. My name is Dan Lane, and this has been the Rental Income Podcast.